It was supposed to be a quiet night like any other. I sat on my back porch, sipping lukewarm tea, gazing up at the sky as I always did when I needed to unwind. But tonight something was wrong, something I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. The stars twinkled faintly, yet the sky felt darker, emptier than usual. Then it hit me like a slap to the face. The moon was gone. Not hidden behind clouds, not faint from a lunar eclipse, just gone, as if someone had reached up and plucked it from the heavens. My heart sank, and my pulse quickened. I turned on the TV, frantically flipping through channels, hoping for an explanation, but every station showed the same unnerving message. Emergency alert, the moon is missing. Stay indoors. It felt like a joke at first, like some elaborate prank, but the dread in the announcer's trembling voice erased any doubt. My phone buzzed violently with notifications, friends and family sending panicked messages, news articles flooding in, but no one seemed to know what was happening. Outside, the world was unnervingly quiet, as if the disappearance of the moon had stolen all sound with it. The neighborhood, usually alive with the faint hum of crickets and distant laughter, was now cloaked in a suffocating silence. I stepped out into the street, my unease growing with every step, and found my neighbors gathered in small, murmuring clusters. We exchanged glances, all of us searching for answers in each other's faces but finding none. The air felt heavier, colder, and I swear the stars seemed farther away than they had just the night before. A faint static buzzed from a nearby radio someone had brought out, the announcer repeating the same chilling words. The moon is gone. Stay calm. Stay inside. But staying calm was impossible when the natural order of the universe had been upended. I went back inside and locked the door, my hands trembling as I pulled the blinds shut. What could have caused this? A scientific anomaly? Government cover-up? Or something far beyond human comprehension? My tea sat untouched, cooling on a counter, forgotten in the rising tide of my fear. I felt like a child again, afraid of the dark, except this darkness wasn't imaginary. It was real and pressing, wrapping around the world like a suffocating shroud. Sleep was out of the question. I sat by the window, staring at the black sky, hoping for any sign of the moon's return. But all that greeted me was an oppressive void, an emptiness that seemed to echo in my chest. Something about the absence felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, as if the universe itself had shifted, leaving us adrift in an unfamiliar reality. And then, as if on cue, the power went out. The sudden plunge into complete darkness stole my breath, and for the first time in my life, I realized just how fragile our world truly was. When the power went out, the true depth of the night enveloped everything like a black hole, erasing even the faintest traces of familiarity. The hum of electricity, the distant glow of streetlights, everything was gone, leaving me alone with the suffocating silence and the questions swirling in my mind. I lit a candle, its dim, flickering light casting distorted shadows on the walls, and for a moment, I felt a fragile sense of control. But that illusion was shattered when I stepped outside the next morning. The air was biting cold, far colder than it had any right to be for this time of year. Frost clung to my windows, and the grass beneath my feet crunched like brittle glass. The sun rose sluggishly, its light weaker, its warmth feeble. People were out in the streets again, their voices tinged with panic as they shared the latest rumors. The tides are acting up, one man said, his voice barely above a whisper. The ocean's pulling back farther than it should, then rushing in like it's trying to devour the shore. Another woman clutched her child, her eyes darting nervously toward the sky. The stars, they look different. Like they've shifted somehow. I wanted to dismiss it all as paranoia, but even I could feel it, the sense that the universe was unraveling. Over the next few days, things only got stranger. Nights became impossibly long, as if time itself was stretching, and the cold seeped deeper into my bones, no matter how many layers I wore. My house, once a sanctuary, felt alien, the shadows in the corners growing darker, denser, like they were watching me. And then there was the sky. Without the moon, the stars became unnervingly vivid, their light piercing and unnatural. Sometimes they seemed to flicker in patterns, like they were trying to communicate or warn. But warn of what? The animals in the neighborhood, usually so lively, became eerily quiet. Dogs that used to bark incessantly now huddled in silence, their eyes fixed on something unseen. Birds disappeared altogether, leaving the skies eerily still during the day. My own body started to feel the strain of this new reality. Sleep became elusive, and when I did manage to drift off, My dreams were fragmented, filled with strange symbols and whispers I couldn't understand. My reflection in the mirror looked off. My eyes seemed sunken, my skin paler, like the light of the absent moon had taken something vital with it. On the news, scientists offered no explanations, only frantic reassurances that everything was under control. But their voices betrayed their fear. Some spoke of gravitational anomalies, others of cosmic disruptions, but no one had answers. The emergency alerts continued, their ominous tones now a regular part of life, warning us to stay indoors after dark and report any unusual occurrences. Unusual occurrences? They were everywhere. One night, as I stared out of my window, I noticed something I couldn't explain. The stars seemed closer, too close. One of them, a faint red light, pulsed steadily, almost like a heartbeat. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but it was still there watching. I shut the blinds and retreated to the safety of my candlelight, but the image burned in my mind. The world was changing, and so was I. Whatever had taken the moon wasn't finished with us yet. By the end of the first week without the moon, the world felt like it was teetering on the edge of collapse. What began as whispers and unease had escalated into full-blown paranoia. People were different now, edgy, quick to anger, their eyes darting to the sky as though expecting some unseen force to descend upon us. The streets were littered with abandoned cars, their owners either too frightened or too disoriented to drive. Stores were ransacked, shelves stripped bare of essentials as if people believed they could fortify themselves against the unknown with canned goods and bottled water. But what scared me more than the chaos outside was the growing sense that someone was watching. The emergency broadcasts became more frequent, their tone more urgent but no less vague. "Stay inside after dark," they repeated. "Report unusual activity to authorities. Do not attempt to investigate celestial anomalies." Celestial anomalies. That phrase lingered in my mind, heavy with implications I couldn't fully comprehend. What could they mean? Were they seeing something we weren't? My neighbors stopped speaking to one another. Doors and windows remained locked tight, and the once vibrant hum of the community turned into a void of silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of static from the emergency radios. The sky had changed in ways that were difficult to articulate. Without the moon, it felt unnervingly vast, as though the universe had expanded overnight. The stars were sharper, brighter, and seemed to throb with an otherworldly intensity. On certain nights, they would shift subtly, forming patterns that resembled nothing I had ever seen. Constellations twisted into unfamiliar shapes, and a faint, pulsating glow began to emanate from the horizon, like a distant wildfire that refused to approach. I stared at it for hours, trying to decipher its source, but it always seemed just out of reach, both physically and mentally. By now, the effects of the moon's absence were impossible to ignore. The tides were erratic, flooding coastal towns one day and leaving ships stranded in muddy plains the next. The global temperature dropped steadily, frost creeping into places that had never seen snow. The sun, already weak, seemed dimmer each day, casting the world in a perpetual state of twilight. Nights stretched longer and colder, the darkness swallowing entire days, and with each passing hour, it became harder to tell where one ended and the next began. I began to hear strange sounds at night, low, mournful hums that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no breeze, no rustling of leaves to accompany it. The hum grew louder as the night stretched on, vibrating through my bones and setting my teeth on edge. My dreams became darker, filled with impossible landscapes bathed in red light, where shadowy figures loomed just out of sight. I woke each morning drenched in sweat, the whispers from my dreams still ringing in my ears. The government's attempts to maintain order only fueled the growing hysteria. Military vehicles rolled into towns, setting up checkpoints and issuing vague warnings to prepare for extended periods of isolation. The news was a constant loop of scientists offering theories that sounded more like desperate guesses. Some blamed gravitational shifts, others suggested an interstellar event we couldn't yet comprehend. But deep down, everyone knew there was more to it. The moon's disappearance wasn't just an accident of the cosmos. It was deliberate, and whoever or whatever was responsible wasn't done with us. One night I couldn't sleep. The hum in the air was louder than ever, and the shadows in my room seemed to pulse in time with it. I found myself drawn to the window, unable to resist the urge to look outside. The sky was darker than usual, the stars dim and flickering as though they were being swallowed by some unseen force. And then I saw it, a faint silhouette against the horizon, towering and unnatural. It didn't move, but its presence was palpable, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I stumbled back from the window, my breath hitching as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. It wasn't even from this world. As the days turned into weeks, the changes became more personal. My reflection in the mirror no longer felt like my own. My eyes seemed darker, my pupils too wide, and my skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality. I began to see things in the corner of my vision, shapes that vanished when I turned to look, but left a lingering sense of unease. I wasn't alone in this. Others reported similar experiences, hearing voices that weren't there, seeing lights that moved unnaturally, feeling watched even in the safety of their homes. The world wasn't just falling apart, it was changing, and we were changing with it. One morning, I woke to find a thin layer of ash covering everything outside. It wasn't from a fire. It smelled metallic, alien, and left a faint, tingling sensation on my skin. The air itself felt heavier, harder to breathe, as though it carried an invisible weight. I tried to call my family, desperate for some connection, but the lines were dead. Even the internet was failing, websites loading slower until they stopped altogether. We were being cut off, one thread at a time, and the realization that we were utterly alone settled over me like a shroud. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed, studied, like ants under a magnifying glass. And yet, whoever was watching didn't seem to be in a hurry. They were patient, methodical, waiting for something. But waiting for what? It had been 3 weeks since the moon disappeared, and by now, the world I once knew felt like a distant memory. The streets were emptier than ever, and even during the day, there was a sense of heaviness in the air, a pervasive stillness that clung to everything like fog. People only ventured outside when absolutely necessary, their eyes darting to the sky as though expecting something to reach down and snatch them away. I tried to keep a routine, to hold on to some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. The days felt endless, the nights even more so, and time itself seemed to blur as the fabric of reality stretched thinner with each passing moment. The lights were the first sign that something was fundamentally wrong. They started as faint glimmers on the horizon, barely noticeable against the deep black of the sky. At first, I thought they were planes or satellites, but they didn't move like anything man-made. They hovered in place for hours, their glow pulsating faintly, and then they would vanish without a trace. Some nights, there were dozens of them, scattered across the sky like strange constellations. Other nights, there was only one, large, bright, and impossibly close. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, watching all of us. The whispers came next. At first, they were so faint that I thought they were part of my imagination, a symptom of my fraying nerves. But as the nights grew longer, they became clearer, more insistent. They didn't sound like any language I recognized, but there was an undeniable rhythm to them, a cadence that felt ancient and otherworldly. I tried to ignore them, to drown them out with music or the static of the emergency radio, but they always found a way through. Sometimes, they seemed to come from inside the walls of my house. Other times, they felt as though they were inside my head. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make them stop. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard something new, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced, a sound so deep and powerful that it felt as though the very earth beneath me was groaning in protest. I sat up, my heart pounding, and realized that the hum wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from above. I rushed to the window, my hands trembling as I pulled back the curtains, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. The sky was alive with movement. Dozens of lights swirled and danced in intricate patterns, their glow casting eerie shadows across the landscape. They moved with purpose, as though performing some kind of ritual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were searching for something, or someone. The next morning, the news was filled with reports of similar sightings from around the world. People described the lights as beautiful and terrifying, their voices trembling with awe and fear. Some claimed to have heard the whispers as well, and a few even reported seeing figures in the darkness, tall, thin silhouettes with glowing eyes that vanished the moment they were spotted. The emergency broadcasts offered no explanations, only the same hollow reassurances that everything is under control. But it was clear to everyone that whatever was happening was far beyond our understanding and far beyond our control. As the lights and whispers grew more frequent, other strange phenomena began to occur. Electronic devices stopped working without warning, their screens flickering with static before shutting down completely. Animals that had once been silent began to act erratically, howling and crying out as though sensing an impending disaster. Plants wilted and turned black, their leaves crumbling to ash at the slightest touch. Even the air itself felt different, thicker, heavier, as though it carried an invisible weight. I started to notice that my breath would fog up even indoors, despite the fact that the thermostat was set to a normal temperature. It was as if the entire world was slowly freezing, both literally and metaphorically. I began to feel a growing unease in my own home. The shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, their edges sharp and unnatural. Sometimes I would catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. At night, the whispers grew louder, their tone more urgent, almost pleading. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel the intent behind them, an overwhelming sense of sorrow, fear, and desperation. It was as though they were trying to warn me, to tell me something important, but I couldn't make sense of it. One particularly cold night, as I stared out the window at the swirling lights, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The stars were moving, not all of them, but enough to form patterns that hadn't been there before. It was subtle at first, but as I watched, it became clear that they were aligning into shapes that seemed deliberate, almost intelligent. I tried to convince myself that it was a trick of the eye, a product of my overactive imagination, but deep down I knew the truth. The stars weren't just moving, they were watching. The hum returned that night, louder than ever, and this time it brought something with it. A low, guttural vibration echoed through the air, shaking the walls of my house and rattling the dishes in my cabinets. I clutched my head, the sound piercing through me like a physical force, and for a brief moment, I felt as though my mind was being pulled apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and in that silence, I heard a single chilling word whispered directly into my ear: prepare. The word prepare echoed in my mind long after the hum and whispers faded. I sat in stunned silence, the single word looping endlessly in my thoughts. Prepare for what? I wanted to dismiss it as another figment of my stressed mind, a trick of my imagination, but it felt too real, too deliberate. The whispers weren't just random sounds anymore. They carried intent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were meant for me specifically. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to the whispers, even when they terrified me. I began writing down the patterns, the pauses, the cadence, and though the language was unfamiliar, I started noticing recurring phrases, or what felt like phrases. It was as though they were trying to teach me, to force me to understand something vital. At night, the whispers grew louder, almost overwhelming, and the lights in the sky seemed to pulse in rhythm with the sounds. I kept my curtains drawn, but it made no difference. The strange, otherworldly glow seeped through the fabric, painting my walls with shifting patterns that looked like symbols. I started seeing those same symbols elsewhere, on my walls, my windows, even on my skin. They appeared in the condensation on my mirror, in the frost that coated my windows every morning. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, but when I touched them, they felt real. The symbols pulsed faintly under my fingers, warm and alive, and I could feel them vibrating, almost as if they were trying to communicate. Desperate for answers, I began searching through old books, websites, and forums, but most of the internet was down, and the remaining sources were filled with hysteria and misinformation. Still, I found fragments of folklore that made my stomach churn. Stories about ancient beings that existed before time, entities tied to the moon and the tides, who'd been banished to the void long ago. Some of the stories described them as watchers, others as destroyers, but one thing was consistent. They were patient, waiting for the right moment to return. And when they did, it would mark the end of the world as we knew it. The emergency broadcast continued, but they provided no new information, only repeating the same warnings: stay indoors. Do not attempt to investigate celestial anomalies. Report unusual activity. But what qualified as unusual anymore? Everything felt unusual. The lights, the symbols, the whispers, they were all connected. I was certain of it. But no one else seemed to notice the patterns. My neighbors had grown quiet, withdrawn, and I stopped seeing them altogether. Their houses sat dark and empty, and I began to wonder if they had left or if something had taken them. One night, as I sat by the window staring at the shifting stars, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A faint, shadowy shape hung in the sky, barely visible against the blackness. It wasn't a cloud, and it didn't move like the lights. It was massive, stretching across the horizon like a dark shroud, and I realized with a jolt of terror that it wasn't just a shape. It was a structure. The lights weren't random. They were part of it, outlining its impossible dimensions. It hung there, silent and oppressive, like a predator watching its prey. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as I realized what I was looking at. The moon hadn't just disappeared. It had been taken. The symbols I had been seeing weren't random, either. They were part of a message, a warning that was becoming clearer with each passing day. I began to dream of them, vivid, lucid dreams where the symbols glowed with a fiery intensity, and the whispers became voices, overlapping and chaotic but unmistakably urgent. "You must see," they said. "You must understand." In these dreams, I saw glimpses of the dark structure in the sky, its surface covered in the same symbols, shifting and writhing as though alive. I saw humanity, small and insignificant, standing on the edge of an abyss, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Whatever had taken the moon wasn't just observing us, it was preparing us for something. I started to notice other changes as well, subtle but unmistakable. Time felt different, slower, and heavier, as though the fabric of reality was stretching to accommodate something massive. The air carried a faint metallic taste, and every breath felt like an effort. My own body seemed to be changing too. My reflection in the mirror looked less like me with each passing day. My eyes were darker, my skin paler, and strange marks began to appear on my arms, patterns that matched the symbols I had been seeing. They didn't hurt, but they pulsed faintly, warm to the touch, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were alive. The whispers grew more insistent, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony that filled my mind even when I was awake. They spoke of the return, of the Watchers, and of a reckoning that was coming for us all. I tried to block them out, to drown them in music or static, but it was useless. They were inside me now, part of me, and no amount of denial could change that. I was connected to whatever was happening, whether I wanted to be or not. And then, one night, I saw it. As I stared out the window, the lights in the sky began to shift, forming a massive, glowing symbol that stretched across the entire horizon. It pulsed with a blinding intensity, and for a moment, I felt as though the world itself had stopped. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they were a deafening roar. "Prepare," they said. "The veil is thinning. The time is near." I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the light consumed everything, and in that moment, I knew there was no going back. The truth was out there, just beyond the veil, waiting to be revealed. And whatever it was coming for us. The night the symbol appeared across the sky was the night everything changed. I could no longer pretend that this was a natural event or an anomaly that scientists could explain away. The universe itself had shifted, and we were at the center of it. The glowing symbol lingered for hours, its intricate patterns twisting and pulsing like a living organism. It wasn't just a visual display. It was a message. I didn't understand all of it, but something deep inside me did. It resonated in my chest, a heavy, oppressive weight that felt both foreign and disturbingly familiar. The whispers in my mind had grown louder, more coherent, and though I still couldn't understand the language, I could feel its meaning. We were being prepared for something monumental. The following days were a blur of fear and discovery. I became obsessed with the symbols, drawing them on every scrap of paper I could find, trying to decipher their meaning. They were everywhere now, etched into the frost on my windows, glowing faintly on the walls, even appearing on my skin in intricate, shifting patterns. They felt alive, their movements subtle but undeniable, as if they were reacting to my thoughts. I began to realize that they weren't just random marks. They were part of a larger design, a map of sorts, guiding me towards something I couldn't yet see. My dreams became more vivid, more intense. Every night, I found myself standing in a vast, empty void, surrounded by towering figures cloaked in shadow. They loomed over me, their forms indistinct but undeniably powerful, their presence suffocating. The whispers filled the air, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that pressed against my mind, and the symbols glowed brightly at my feet, forming a path that led into the darkness. I followed it, compelled by a force I couldn't resist, and at the end of the path I saw it, the moon. It wasn't gone, it had been taken. Suspended in the void, it pulsed with a faint, sickly light, its surface marred by deep, jagged cracks. It was a prison, I realized, a vessel containing something ancient and powerful. And now that prison had been broken. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. The moon wasn't just a celestial body. It was a seal, a barrier that had kept something contained for millennia. Its disappearance wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act, a calculated move to unleash whatever lay trapped within. The whispers confirmed it, their voices tinged with urgency and sorrow. The Watchers return, they said. The balance is broken. I woke up drenched in sweat, my body trembling, the symbols on my skin burning with an intense heat. The message was clear. Something was coming, and it was far beyond anything humanity could comprehend. The signs were everywhere now, impossible to ignore. The sky grew darker with each passing day, the stars dimming until they were little more than faint pinpricks of light. The strange hum that had once been a subtle vibration was now a constant presence, vibrating through the air and the ground, growing louder and more intense with each passing hour. People began to vanish without explanation, entire families disappearing from their homes, their doors left wide open, their belongings untouched. Those who remained spoke in hushed tones of shadowy figures seen lurking at the edges of their vision, figures that vanished the moment you turned to look at them. I couldn't ignore the changes in myself either. My reflection had become a stranger, my eyes darker, my features sharper, more alien. The marks on my skin had spread, forming intricate, glowing patterns that seemed to shift and writhe of their own accord. I could feel them now, a faint, constant pressure beneath my skin, as though something was trying to break free. The whispers were no longer just in my dreams. They followed me everywhere, a constant, insistent presence that I couldn't escape. They spoke of the veil thinning, of the return of the old ones, and of the reckoning that awaited us all. I started to see connections where I hadn't before, fragments of information falling into place like pieces of a puzzle. The moon's disappearance wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a larger plan, one that had been set into motion long before humanity even existed. The ancient stories I had dismissed as myth and superstition were true. The Watchers, the old ones, the beings who had been banished beyond the veil, they were real, and they were coming back. The moon had been their prison, its gravitational pull not just a force of nature, but a barrier that kept them locked away. And now that barrier was gone. The symbols on my skin began to glow brighter, their movements more pronounced, as though responding to the whispers in my mind. I could feel them guiding me, pushing me towards something I couldn't yet see. My house, once a place of safety, had become a prison of its own, the walls closing in on me as the hum grew louder, more oppressive. I knew I couldn't stay. I had to find the source of the whispers, the heart of the symbols, and uncover the truth about what was happening. But deep down, I feared that the truth would be more terrifying than anything I could imagine. One night, as I stared out at the darkened sky, the whispers in my mind coalesced into a single chilling command: go to the light. I didn't understand what it meant, but I could feel its urgency, its weight. The lights that had once hovered on the horizon were closer now, their glow brighter and more intense, forming a path that stretched into the distance. I knew I had no choice. Whatever lay at the end of that path held the answers I sought, and the horrors I feared. When the whispers told me to go to the light, I hesitated. It wasn't that I didn't believe them. By now, I had no choice but to trust what they were telling me. But the thought of leaving the fragile safety of my home, of stepping into a world that was unraveling before my eyes, filled me with dread. Still, I knew I couldn't ignore the pull any longer. The lights on the horizon had grown brighter and more distinct, their pulsating glow casting eerie shadows on the landscape. They were a beacon, a call that I couldn't resist, no matter how much I wanted to. I packed what little I could, a flashlight, some food, a notebook filled with sketches of the symbols, and stepped out into the night. The air was heavy, thick, with a strange, metallic tang that made it hard to breathe. The ground beneath my feet felt brittle, as though the earth itself was beginning to decay. As I walked, the hum that had become a constant presence in my life grew louder, vibrating through my body with every step. It was both oppressive and strangely comforting, like a heartbeat that wasn't my own. The whispers in my mind had quieted, but the symbols on my skin glowed faintly, their patterns shifting and writhing as if guiding me toward my destination. The world around me was eerily silent. Houses stood dark and abandoned, their windows like empty eyes staring out into the void. Cars were left in the middle of the street, doors flung open, their occupants long gone. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting across a window, a faint glow flickering in the distance. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. It felt as though the world itself was watching me, holding its breath as I moved deeper into the unknown. The farther I went, the stranger things became. The stars above me, once dim and flickering, now seemed to swirl and dance in patterns that made my head spin. The ground beneath me cracked and shifted, faint lines of light glowing through the fractures like veins of molten gold. At one point, I came across a tree that had been twisted into an impossible shape, its branches curling and looping in a way that defied logic. The air around it shimmered, and as I stepped closer, I felt a strange warmth radiating from it. The whispers returned then, faint but insistent, warning me to keep moving. I didn't need to be told twice. As I continued, I began to notice remnants of the world that had once been. A child's bicycle, its frame rusted and bent, lay abandoned in the middle of the road. A storefront window displayed mannequins draped in tattered clothing, their blank faces turned upward as if gazing at the strange sky. In one house, I saw a table set for dinner, plates and glasses still in place, but no sign of the people who had once lived there. It was as though the world had been frozen in time, a snapshot of a life that no longer existed. And then there were the voices. They started faintly, barely more than a murmur, but as I walked, they grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that made my head throb. They weren't like the whispers I had grown used to. They were different, more primal, filled with a raw, animalistic intensity that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I could feel their meaning: anger, fear, desperation. It was as though the fabric of reality itself was crying out, protesting the intrusion of whatever had broken through the veil. The lights on the horizon grew closer, their glow brighter and more intense, until they seemed to dominate the entire landscape. I could see now that they weren't just lights. They were shapes, towering structures that pulsed with a faint, otherworldly energy. They defied description, their forms shifting and changing with every glance, as though they existed in multiple dimensions at once. The ground around them glowed faintly, etched with the same symbols that covered my skin, and I could feel their pull, a magnetic force that drew me closer with every step. The whispers returned then, louder and more insistent than ever. "You are close," they said. "The veil is thin here. You must see." Their urgency filled me with a renewed sense of purpose, even as fear clawed at the edges of my mind. I stepped into the glow of the lights, the hum now a deafening roar, and felt the air around me change. It was heavier, charged with an energy that made my skin tingle and my heart race. The symbols on my skin burned brightly, their patterns shifting faster than ever, and I knew I was on the verge of something monumental. As I approached the largest of the structures, I noticed that the symbols on its surface matched those on my skin exactly. They pulsed in unison, a rhythmic beat that seemed to resonate with the very core of my being. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus, and I realized that they weren't just guiding me, they were preparing me. The veil between worlds was thinner here than anywhere else, and whatever lay beyond it was waiting for me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come, and stepped into the light. The moment I stepped into the light, the world I knew disappeared. It wasn't like walking through a door or crossing a threshold. It was as though reality itself had been stripped away, leaving me suspended in a void that defied all logic. The ground beneath my feet vanished, replaced by an endless expanse of shimmering light that seemed to stretch into infinity. The air was thick and heavy, filled with a low, resonant hum that vibrated through my entire body. I couldn't tell if I was moving or standing still, if I was floating or falling. All I knew was that I wasn't alone. The whispers in my mind exploded into a cacophony of voices, overlapping and chaotic, their urgency overwhelming. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but their meaning was clear. "You have arrived." As the light around me pulsed and shifted, I began to see shapes emerging from the void. They were massive, towering forms that seemed to be made of the same shimmering light, their outlines constantly shifting and reconfiguring. They had no defined features, no faces or limbs, yet their presence was undeniable. I could feel their gaze on me, piercing and unrelenting, as though they were looking straight into my soul. One of the entities stepped, or perhaps flowed, closer, its form bending and twisting in ways that hurt to look at. The symbols on my skin flared brightly, mirroring the patterns on its surface, and I felt an unbearable pressure in my chest, as though it was reaching inside me. "You are the bridge," the whispers said, but this time, the words didn't come from within me. They came from the entity itself. Its voice was deep and resonant, filled with an ancient power that made the ground, or whatever I was standing on, tremble. The moon was never yours, it said, its words echoing in my mind. It was a seal, a barrier to keep us bound. Your kind has forgotten, but we have not. We were here before you, and we will be here long after. The words filled me with a cold, creeping dread, their meaning sinking into me like ice. The moon wasn't just a celestial body, it was a lock. And now that lock was broken. As I stood there, frozen in terror, the other entities began to move, their forms swirling and twisting around me in a hypnotic dance. The light grew brighter, almost blinding, and I could feel their power pressing down on me, suffocating and overwhelming. The balance has been broken, they said. Your world will become as it was meant to be, a place of passage, a bridge between realms. I didn't fully understand what they meant, but the implications were horrifying. Humanity wasn't the center of this world. We were merely caretakers, a temporary presence in a place that was never truly ours. The symbols on my skin burned hotter, their patterns shifting faster and faster, and I realized with a jolt of terror that they were reacting to the entities. They weren't just marks, they were a part of me, a connection to whatever these beings were. The whispers grew louder, their urgency almost unbearable, and I felt a strange pull, as though something within me was trying to break free. You carry the key, the entities said. You are the vessel through which we will return. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't just a witness to this event. I was a part of it. The marks on my skin, the whispers in my mind, the strange changes I had experienced, they weren't coincidences. They were preparations. I had been chosen, shaped, and marked for this moment. I tried to speak, to protest, but my voice was swallowed by the void, lost in the overwhelming presence of the entities. As they moved closer, their forms growing brighter and more defined, I saw flashes of something, memories that weren't mine. I saw ancient civilizations crumbling beneath a sky filled with light, their inhabitants screaming as the ground split open and the air turned to fire. I saw vast, incomprehensible shapes descending from the heavens, their forms bending and twisting reality itself. And I saw the moon, whole and unbroken, shining brightly in the sky as a barrier was placed around it, sealing these beings away. You have called us back, the entities said, their voices blending into a single deafening roar. Your world is the bridge, and the bridge must be opened. The light around me pulsed violently, and I felt the searing pain in my chest, as though something was being torn from within me. The symbols on my skin flared one last time, their patterns locking into place, and I realized with a sickening certainty that the process was complete. I was the key, and the door was about to be opened. The realization that I was the key, that I had been marked, chosen, and shaped for this moment, was both horrifying and paralyzing. The symbols on my skin pulsed with a blinding light, their intricate patterns locking into place as if completing some ancient mechanism. I felt a deep, agonizing pull in my chest, as though my very essence was being drawn outward, piece by piece, toward the towering entities surrounding me. Their forms swirled and shifted, their light growing more intense with each passing moment, and the hum in the air rose to a deafening crescendo. You are the bridge, they repeated, their voices resonating in unison, shaking the very fabric of this surreal realm. The balance has been broken, and the passage must be restored. I wanted to scream, to beg, to plead for them to stop, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the overwhelming presence of these beings. The light around me pulsed in rhythm with the symbols on my skin, and I could feel the veil between worlds beginning to tear. It was like a physical thing, a fragile membrane stretching and cracking under the immense pressure of the entity's will. The whispers in my mind grew frantic, overlapping and chaotic, as though they were trying to warn me of something. You must resist, they said, their voices faint and distant. You must hold the line. But how could I resist when my very body had been turned into a tool for their purpose? The symbols burned hotter, their light searing into my flesh, and I could feel something within me breaking. It wasn't just my body. It was my mind, my soul, my connection to the world I had once known. I was being unraveled, piece by piece, transformed into something I couldn't begin to understand. Around me, the entities began to move in a deliberate, ritualistic pattern, their forms intertwining as they chanted in a language that resonated with an ancient, primal power. The light between them grew brighter, forming a swirling vortex that seemed to stretch into infinity. It was both beautiful and horrifying, a mesmerizing display of raw, cosmic energy that defied comprehension. As I watched, the vortex began to pull at the fabric of reality itself, distorting the space around it and creating fractures that revealed glimpses of the world beyond. Through the cracks in the veil, I could see shapes moving, vast, incomprehensible forms that dwarfed even the entities surrounding me. They were shadows against an infinite expanse of light, their movements slow and deliberate, but filled with an undeniable sense of purpose. These were the true Watchers, the ancient beings that had been locked away beyond the veil for millennia. And now, they were stirring, awakening from their slumber, their attention fixed on the fragile world that had once been their prison. The vortex grew larger, its pull more intense, and I could feel myself being drawn toward it. The entities circled closer, their light merging with the glow of the symbols on my skin, and I realized with a jolt of terror that I was the final piece of the ritual. My body, my mind, my very existence was the key to completing their return. I struggled against the pull, but it was useless. The force was too strong, too overwhelming, and I could feel myself slipping away. As the vortex reached its peak, the whispers in my mind grew louder, more desperate. "You must remember," they said, their voices tinged with sorrow and urgency. "You must find the light within." I didn't know what they meant, but I clung to their words like a lifeline, desperate for anything that might save me from the inevitable. The entity's chant reached a crescendo, their voices blending into a single, deafening roar, and the vortex exploded with light. For a moment, everything was silent. The hum, the whispers, the chanting, all of it was gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness that pressed down on me like a physical weight. And then the veil tore open. The world around me shattered, fragments of light and shadow spiraling outward into the void, and I was consumed by the vortex. It wasn't like falling. It was like being pulled apart. My body and mind stretched thin as I was drawn into the infinite expanse beyond. On the other side, there was nothing but light. It was blinding, all-encompassing, and filled with a profound sense of power and presence. I felt small, insignificant, a single thread in an infinite tapestry of existence. And yet, I could feel the attention of the Watchers fixed on me, their immense forms looming in the distance. They didn't speak, but their intent was clear. The bridge had been opened, and their return was inevitable. In that moment, I realized the full extent of what had been set into motion. The moon's disappearance, the symbols, the whispers, it had all been leading to this. Humanity was not the masters of this world. We were merely caretakers, placeholders for something far greater and far more terrifying. The Watchers were here to reclaim what had once been theirs, and there was nothing we could do to stop them. As the light consumed me, I felt a deep, aching sorrow for the world I had left behind. I thought of the people I had known, the life I had lived, and the fragile beauty of a world that had been taken for granted. And then I was gone, my consciousness dissolving into the infinite expanse of light, my role as the bridge complete. I was no longer falling. I was no longer standing. I was simply existing, suspended in the endless light, stretched thin across an expanse of space and time that had no beginning and no end. The entities that had drawn me here no longer looked like shifting shapes of light and shadow. They were something greater, something ancient, something incomprehensible. I could feel them more than I could see them, their presence woven into the fabric of reality itself, and in that moment, I understood the truth. The Watchers were not returning. They had never truly left. The moon had been a barrier, a seal placed long before humanity had even begun to walk upright, a safeguard against forces that could not be destroyed, only contained. It was never about us. Our existence was incidental, a flicker in time, something that had grown in the absence of the Watchers but was never meant to remain. And now the balance had shifted. The Watchers did not rage. They did not seek vengeance. They simply took back what had always belonged to them. From my place within the void, I could see it happening. The veil between worlds had been torn open, and the light from beyond spilled into the darkened sky of Earth. The stars flickered and rearranged themselves, no longer adhering to the familiar constellations that humanity had named over millennia. The night stretched infinitely, devouring the last remnants of day. The sky was no longer just a sky. It was a living thing, a vast, swirling ocean of shapes and lights and unfathomable entities that had begun to descend. The world below was changing. Cities flickered in and out of existence as the fabric of space bent and folded, rewriting itself in ways that the human mind was never meant to comprehend. People, those who had not already disappeared, stood frozen, staring up at the impossible sky, their faces bathed in the light of something they could neither understand nor escape. Some fell to their knees, whispering prayers that would never be answered. Others wandered aimlessly, as though their minds had already detached from their bodies, lost in the realization that the world they had known was gone. I saw the oceans rise and twist into spirals that stretched toward the heavens, defying gravity as they merged with the shifting stars. I saw entire mountains crumble into dust, then reform into impossible shapes, their peaks curling upward like fingers reaching for something unseen. The cities that remained began to warp, their buildings elongating, their windows stretching into hollow, gaping voids. It was as if reality itself was being rewritten to accommodate the return of the Watchers. And I was part of it. I could feel myself dissolving into the new order, my body no longer bound by flesh and bone, but by something else, something timeless. I was not one of them, not yet, but I was no longer one of humanity either. I had become the bridge, the space between the last remnant of what once was, now tethered to what would come next. I could still hear the whispers, but they were no longer frantic. They were calm, resigned, as though the voices that had once warned me had finally accepted their fate. The last pieces of my humanity slipped away as I watched the final transition take place. The Watchers were no longer just shapes of light and shadow. They were here, fully present, towering over the landscape, their forms stretching beyond the limits of comprehension. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their mere presence reshaped the world, bending reality around them like clay in the hands of an unseen sculptor. Time no longer moved forward. It expanded outward, looping, spiraling, converging and diverging all at once. The world had become something new, something alien, something that had existed before but had been hidden beneath the thin layer of human perception. And now there was no more hiding. The veil had been lifted. The bridge had been opened. I was still there, somewhere in the vastness, watching, feeling, existing between the worlds. I had become something eternal, something nameless. The last fragment of the old world, preserved in the endless light of the new one. And as I drifted through the infinite expanse, one final thought passed through what was left of my mind. The moon had never belonged to us, and neither had the earth.